Hello, can you guys hear me? Yes? All right, good. Welcome. Sorry for the delay in the start. We were just waiting for a couple of more people to arrive. My name is Shamta Hunter, and I work with UBC Sustainability Initiative, and I welcome to UBC Read Sustainability today. UBC Read Sustainability is a speaker series that aims to bring authors on relevant global and local issues to engage the UBC community in dialogues across discipline and build connections. I want to acknowledge that we are on ancestral, traditional, and unceded land of the Musqueam peoples. Today's talk is actually all about the land and the place, and how we all, First Nations and settlers, need to come together to preserve our nature and heritage that we are borrowing from our generations to come. So before I introduce our speaker for today, a couple of housekeeping items. Washrooms are just down the hall on that side. You can use the door, but please make sure that it is a little bit closed off. I'll ask that you please hold on to your questions until after the talk. Please note the event is being video recorded, so if you do ask a question at the end, you will be on camera. The recording will be archived at the UBC YouTube channel, so you can use it later on and also share it with your friends. Sarah has also agreed very graciously to stay afterwards to sign some books and answer questions. Okay, so at this time, please turn off any of your phones, and I would like to introduce and invite our speaker. Sarah is an award-winning journalist and specializes in energy and environmental issues. Reaching the Peace, the Sightsee Dam and a Valley's Stand Against Big Hydro is her first book. It's an inspiring and astonishing story of farmers and First Nations who stood up against the most expensive mega project in British Columbia history and the government sanctions bullying that propelled it forward. In this book, Sarah reveals the true costs and hidden dangers of the project, as told to her by the local farmers, ranchers, and First Nations leaders who tried to stop the dam and the wholesale destruction of their valley in the courts of law and the court of public opinion. So please welcome Sarah.
Thank you very much. How's that for volume? I'm very honored to be here today and want to acknowledge that we're on unceded Musqueam territory. Thank you for the lovely introduction and for inviting me to be part of UBC Read Sustainability. It's always a treat to be back here on the UBC campus where I spent a few years in the 80s studying political science and working on the UBC newspaper until all hours of the night and frequently missing my 8:30 a.m. class. And thank you to everyone for coming out today to talk about the Sightsee Dam on BC's Peace River. It's easy to think that Sightsee is some project way up there in BC's north that doesn't affect us. A project with a name that sounds quite solutions-oriented in this disquieting age of global warming. The Sightsee Clean Energy Project. Who could quibble with that? Well, quite a lot of people, it turns out. And they include scientists and scholars, the former CEO of BC Hydro, economists, independent energy experts, the chair of the Joint Review Panel that examines Sightsee for the federal and provincial governments, and dozens of Peace Valley landowners, many of them farmers and ranchers, who would lose their homes and land and farms and community to this project. And of seminal importance in a province and a country that have committed to upholding the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. They also include 2 Treaty 8 First Nations who would be directly affected by this project, many members of other Treaty 8 First Nations, Canada's Assembly of First Nations, and the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, which calls this project a complete betrayal of First Nations. Such is the Sightsee Dam's impact on Indigenous peoples that last year in August, the United Nations Committee for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination asked the BC and federal governments to halt this project. The committee called for a full review to be conducted in collaboration with Indigenous peoples to identify alternatives to the irreversible destruction of Indigenous lands. Not only was that request ignored, but the federal government failed to meet a deadline for submitting a follow-up report to the committee, and it still has not responded. I think this is frozen. I was very disturbed, as I'm sure many of you would be, to learn about the deliberate, profound, and heartbreaking impact of Sightsee on Indigenous peoples, as it poisons fish with methyl mercury and destroys the last intact section of the Peace River Valley that's available for First Nations to engage in traditional practices that were guaranteed to them by Treaty 8. And those include teaching their children native languages on the land that helped shape those languages. And I wrote this book out of concern for the failure of due process as the Sightsee Dam project was propelled ahead by various Liberal and NDP governments, and to draw attention to what I increasingly came to see as misinformation about this project and its unprecedented secrecy and lack of transparency. I'm curious to know how many people in this room have ever been up to the Peace. A few. Well, I had never been there myself until about 5 years ago when I went for the first time. It's a long way from the coast. It's a 14-hour drive by car from Vancouver. You can get to Saskatchewan in the same amount of time. And so it's largely out of sight and out of mind for the majority of British Columbians. And that's part of the problem we confront with megaprojects in a province as large as ours. And I think many would share the view that if this project had been proposed for the Lower Mainland or for Vancouver Island, it never would have proceeded. So today I'd like to take you on a journey to the Peace River Valley, a place I came to know and love, and introduce you to some of the farmers and First Nations members who are fighting the Sightsee Dam, and explain a little bit about why they continue to fight this project. At $10.7 billion and counting, Sightsee would be the most expensive, publicly funded infrastructure project in BC's history. It would flood 83 kilometers of the Peace River Valley from Fort St. John to Hudson's Hope, including, and it would also flood 45 kilometers of Peace River tributaries, including the Moberly River and Halfway River. And that would basically put an area from Vancouver to Whistler under up to 50 meters of water, enlarging the river initially by an average of 2 to 3 kilometers, and more in the ensuing years as the unstable banks of the valley slough into the reservoir. The weight of the reservoir would cause groundwater tables to rise for a 2-kilometer radius all around, and it would create its own mini global warming experiment as temperatures lower in the summer, rise in the winter, and more precipitation and fog come to the valley and surroundings. The Peace River Valley is a spectacularly biodiverse area. It's a very rare low elevation valley in the north, and it's on a different axis than many valleys. It faces west to east, which means that moist, warm air from the Pacific rolls in and creates a different climate than the surrounding region. And one side of the valley, the side that you can see there on the left, is largely agricultural, and the other is a mosaic of old-growth boreal forest and wetlands. Two of the first people I met on my initial trip to the Peace were Ken and Arlene Boone, and at the time I had no idea that a few years later I would be writing a book about Sightsee, and the Boones certainly had no idea that they would be central characters in this book. The Boones live on a stunningly beautiful farm in an area called Bear Flat, or Cache Creek, in a farmhouse built by Arlene's grandfather. Cache Creek is a special place for many reasons. One of them is that it is a special cultural area for First Nations, whose ancestors have been gathering in this spot since time immemorial. It's a place where historic trails meet. It's the site of freshwater springs, a place where elder and youth gatherings are held, and the site of an active sweat lodge. It's also a place that has a mass Indigenous grave site, meaning that there's a cluster of graves here known through oral history and acknowledged by the BC government, which has designated the area in the Sightsee project zone around Bear Flat as an archaeological site complex. And these designated archaeological sites are just some of the more than 450 protected archaeological and heritage sites in the Sightsee project zone. Arlene grew up on this land, and 5 generations of her family have harvested its fields. We don't normally think of BC's north when we think of agriculture, but the Peace River Valley has some of the best agricultural lands in the province. Agrologists say they are on par with the growing lands of the Fraser Valley, the Okanagan, and the Creston valleys. Like those valleys, the Peace enjoys a rare triple advantage when it comes to agriculture. It has plenty of arable land, alluvial soil that can grow a wide variety of crops, and a favorable climate. And because of its northerly location, it's got tons of daylight in the summer. The light still shines around midnight, and the sun rises about 4 in the morning, giving plants an opportunity to catch up to the Fraser Valley's longer growing season. And the Peace Valley's farmlands will only improve in capability with climate change, according to scientists. The Sightsee project would destroy more than 12,000 hectares of farmland in the Peace Valley. That's twice the amount of farmland found in all of Richmond. The lands that were quietly removed from BC's agricultural land reserve for Sightsee represent the single largest deletion from the ALR in BC's history. And they prompted Richard Bullock, who's the former chair of BC's Agricultural Land Commission, to call Sightsee a sin against humanity. In addition to the Boone's Farm, most of which would be lost to the floodwaters or to the relocation of a provincial highway out of the flood zone at a cost of more than $500 million, more than 100 other properties along the Peace River would be affected by varying extents by this project. Some families will be left with the chopped up pieces of their former farms, and many are wondering if it will ever be viable to continue farming on the land that is left to them. Other families, including the Boones, seniors in the valley, and families with young children, will be forced out of their homes. They include the Beam family, featured on a Christmas postcard last December, put out by the Peace Valley Environment Association. Amnesty International says that Sightsee doesn't meet international standards for forced evictions, which state that there must be no viable alternatives. And that, along with what Amnesty calls brazen violations of Indigenous rights, is why this global human rights organization has zeroed in on Sightsee as one of its campaigns. And still more farmers and property owners will have to deal with rising groundwater tables caused by the sheer weight of Sightsee's reservoir, which will affect the type of crops they can grow. Others will lose their water sources as wells become inoperable. BC Hydro is obliged to find permanent other sources of water for these homes and farms, which in the case of some means that BC Hydro ratepayers will be paying to truck in water. Eliminating fresh water sources and destroying sizable tracts of some of our richest farmland, especially farmland in the north when we are confronting climate change, is the antithesis of sustainability. In one of the many conversations I had with Arlene about this project, she told me that she could deal with losing her home, her farm, her community, and everything that's familiar and beloved to her, if indeed this project was for the greater good, as both the BC and federal governments have claimed. And this is one of the claims that I want to unpack a little today. This notion that the Sightsee project is for the greater good, that it is in the public interest of British Columbians, that we need the energy, and that even if we did need the energy, that Sightsee is the best way to get that energy. Sightsee was first proposed in the 1950s by the WAC Bennett government, and Bennett dreamed of opening up BC's north, and he envisioned a string of dams on the Peace River. 7 dams were proposed. The first of these dams is one I'm sure that everybody's heard of, the WAC Bennett Dam. And that flooded an area 15 times the size of the city of Vancouver, and it created the Williston Reservoir that you see in this photograph, which is still the 7th largest human-made body of water in the world. And the second dam on the Peace River was the Peace Canyon Dam, which became operational in 1980. And together, the Peace Canyon Dam, the WAC Bennett Dam, are responsible for just over a quarter of the energy that we consume in British Columbia today. So a quarter of the energy used in this building, the lights in this room, come from those two dams. And when WAC Bennett's son Bill was Premier of British Columbia in the early 1980s, he decided to push ahead and build this third dam, known as Sightsee, on the Peace River. Now, any healthy democracy has checks and balances. One is our court system, another is a questioning and independent press, and a third consists of independent regulators, watchdog bodies that make sure that government decisions are in the public interest and not undertaken for partisan political gain. And to monitor BC's energy utilities and the transmission grid that carries energy to this room and everywhere else in British Columbia, we have the BC Utilities Commission. And normally, the BC Utilities Commission would scrutinize a project like Sightsee and make a determination about whether it was in the financial interests of all of us. The BCUC looked at Sightsee in the 1980s when it was proposed. They spent 2 years examining it and heard testimony under oath during those 2 years. And the Commission concluded that BC didn't need the Sightsee Dam and directed BC Hydro, among other things, to examine geothermal as a way of meeting future energy needs. And so the government of the day was compelled to shelve the project. A decade later, BC's Hydro's own board of directors looked at Sightsee as a possibility. And they concluded that Sightsee should never proceed because it was too expensive, because BC didn't need the energy, and because the impact on First Nations and the environment would be far too severe. But then 2 decades later, as part of its focus on tackling global warming, the Gordon Campbell government announced that it would move ahead with Sightsee, which was widely seen as a legacy project in keeping with the vision of populist Premier WAC Bennett. And to ensure that the project moved ahead this time, the government changed the law to remove the BCUC from looking at Sightsee to determine if indeed it was in the public interest. Sightsee was then examined by a joint review panel representing the federal and provincial governments, and after studying the matter, the joint review panel concluded that BC did not need Sightsee's energy in the time frame presented by BC Hydro, and also recommended that it go to the independent BC Utilities Commission for a full review. The panel noted that energy demand in BC has been flat since 2005, despite a fast-growing population. We have so much power in British Columbia these days that BC Hydro is paying independent power producers not to produce energy. And as Sightsee moved along, BC Hydro slashed its energy conservation programs that, according to BC Hydro itself, had saved as much energy as Sightsee would produce. Despite being constrained by new rules for environmental assessment that were introduced by the federal Stephen Harper government, the Joint Review Panel laid out in stark detail Sightsee's impact on First Nations and the environment. And the words serious, permanent, and irreversible appeared throughout its report. And the Joint Review Panel concluded that if BC ever needed more energy, looking at economics alone and not taking into account other considerations such as Indigenous rights or the environment, which I'm going to talk more about in a minute, Sightsee would be the most cost-effective way to produce that power. But that conclusion was reached when Sightsee's price tag stood at $7.9 billion. And when this announcement took place in December 2014, when the government of Christy Clark announced that BC was going to proceed with Sightsee's price tag had jumped to $8.8 billion. And yet, the former Liberal government over and over again repeated the Joint Review Panel's finding that Sightsee would be the most cost-effective means of producing new renewable electricity. And that was when the chair of the Joint Review Panel, Harry Swain, who had been the Federal Director General for Electricity and Deputy Minister of Indian and Northern Affairs, broke with convention and started to speak out publicly against this project. He called the Clark government's refusal to refer the project to the BC Utilities Commission a dereliction of duty. And Harry Swain, along with former BC Hydro CEO Mark Ellison, has become one of Sightsee's staunchest and most vocal opponents. When I interviewed Harry Swain for the book, he said that the findings of the Joint Review Panel were immediately negated when the cost jumped to $8.8 billion, and said Sightsee would not, at that price tag, be the most cost-effective way to produce clean electricity in this province. He said the government had cherry-picked which recommendations to highlight and had taken some of the panel's conclusions out of context. But despite the Joint Review Panel's conclusion that BC didn't need Sightsee's energy in the time frame presented, the BC government, said in its announcement that Sightsee was needed to keep the lights on in BC, a statement repeated by Christy Clark last year on the campaign trail. And because of this false assertion that the energy was needed, the government said the impacts on the environment and First Nations were justified in granting some subsequent permits for the project. And the Trudeau government said that Sightsee was needed for the greater good. Because the theme today is sustainability, I want to drill down into some of this clean energy project's environmental impacts. Sightsee's adverse environmental impacts and its impact on First Nations are so pronounced that the Royal Society of Canada, the country's senior academy of distinguished scholars, artists, and scientists, broke with convention and called on the federal government to halt this project. More than 200 of Canada's leading scholars signed what they referred to as a statement of concern about Sightsee. And a group of researchers here at UBC, led by Dr. Karen Bacher and the program on water governance, found that the project would have more significant adverse environmental effects than any project ever examined in the history of Canada's Environmental Assessment Act. And they compared it to projects in Alberta's oil sands and big mining projects. One of the projects that they compared it to was the Enbridge project, which was scuttled by the Trudeau government on the grounds that its impact on First Nations and the environment would be too severe. And the scholars found that Enbridge would have one serious adverse environmental effect and that Sightsee would have 20. The Peace River Valley is a magical place where 4 biomes meet. The boreal, eastern plains, montane, and alpine ecosystems all bump up against each other in this valley, creating a profuse and colorful mix of species and fostering biodiversity. And according to BC Hydro's own reports, the Sightsee flood zone is home to more than 100 species that are already at risk of extinction. These include plant species like the rare peace daisy, which grows nowhere else on the planet but in the Peace River Valley. It includes butterfly species and 30 bird species and mammal species like bats and this fisher, which moves its young to different nests in old-growth trees to escape predators. And scientists have also found that the valley is home to a surprising number of outlier species, species that are either at the extent of their range or are remnants of past populations. These include the prickly pear cacti, which grows in the Sightsee flood zone on the banks of Cache Creek near the Boone's Farm. Not only is the Peace the furthest north that the prickly pear cacti grows, but it is the furthest north that any of the world's 1,800 cacti species grow. Outlier species can allow scientists to study evolution at work, and as the climate warms, they can learn how species adapt to global warming. Since Halloween is just around the corner, I thought we could take a look at just the spider species that were found by scientists from Western Canada when they held a bio-blitz in the Sightsee flood zone in the summer of 2015. Out of 500 spider species they found, 1/3 were notable records. 5 of these species represented the southernmost populations in their range. Others had never been documented so far north, underscoring the valley's importance as a biological mixing zone. 4 species had never been reported before in BC. And even more exciting for the entomologists was the discovery of a brand new spider species for Canada. Upstream from the Boone's Farm is a wetland called Watson Slough. And birders come from all over the world to spot species like the yellow rail, a secretive swamp bird that calls at night. It's about the size of a week-old chicken, and I went out one night with a group of birders from as far away as Martinique and Australia to try to hear this bird, which you can only hear at night. And it's not one of your more melodious birds. It actually sounds like somebody pecking on an old typewriter. So migrating birds shelter in the Peace River Valley during early fall or late spring storms. The valley is a flyway of continental importance for migrating birds, and more than 30,000 songbirds and woodpeckers nest in the Sightsee Reservoir Zone. Watson Slough is actually a 20-hectare complex of different wetlands, including a rare mauve fen. And elsewhere in the valley, on the other side, are rare and ancient wetlands called tufa seeps. This is a photograph of a tufa seep. They're stunningly beautiful limestone formations with pools of crystal clear water. One botanist told me that he has worked all over North America and never has he seen anything like the grand tufa seeps found in the Sightsee flood zone. The tufa seeps in Watson Slough are some of the 800 hectares of wetlands, an area 4 times the size of Vancouver's West End that would be eliminated by the Sightsee Reservoir. And this is despite the fact that the provincial government calls wetlands one of the most important life support systems on Earth. And BC Hydro itself has ironically noted that the tufa seeps in the Sightsee inundation zone have high conservation values and should be conservation priorities. And the environmental impact of Sightsee is all the more egregious when you consider that scientists have found that greenhouse gas emissions from large reservoirs are far higher than previously thought, and that 80% of these emissions are in the form of methane, a greenhouse gas far more potent than carbon dioxide. Yet we still call this a clean energy project. Why? Because after the chartered flights that fly workers in for shifts have ended, and after the diesel-powered mulchers have chewed up the carbon sinks of old-growth boreal forests in the valley, and after drinking water sources are lost and fish are poisoned and some of Canada's best agricultural land is destroyed, the energy that Sightsee will produce will emit fewer greenhouse gas emissions than sources such as coal or natural gas. Academics here at UBC who have examined the project have found that, contrary to government statements, Sightsee will not produce energy with lower greenhouse gas emissions than BC Hydro's alternative portfolio, which includes wind. I wanted to talk a little bit about Sightsee and treaty rights and reconciliation in the context of this greater good. First Nations all over this province want to engage in clean energy projects, but nations like the Sooke and Taloquiet on Vancouver Island have been forced to put their detailed plans for wind and run-of-river projects on hold because BC Hydro won't buy the electricity. In fact, BC Hydro has now proposed to change the rules for solar so that people and businesses who install solar on their rooftops can no longer sell the extra electricity back to the grid. When I sat down to do an interview with Chief Roland Wilson of West Moberly First Nations, he told me that you can't look at Sightsee out of the context of the other 2 dams on the Peace River and what is going on in the Peace River region in general. There's conventional oil and gas development and fracking and forestry and mining and road building. There's so much development all around the Peace Valley that Global Forest Watch has calculated that the number of linear disturbances put together could circle around the planet 4.5 times. Among the WAC Bennett Dam's other impacts, the reservoir severely reduced moose populations and severed an important caribou migration route. Caribou in the Peace were once so plentiful that First Nations elders described them as like bugs on the landscape, and they are now a hair's breadth away from local extinction. 2 Treaty 8 First Nations, including Chief Wilson's Nation, are now spending hundreds of thousands of dollars a year to tranquilize pregnant caribou cows and airlift them to a pen high on a Peace Mountain where they give birth, and then they release their calves when they're a few months old in the hopes that they'll have a better chance of survival. Another lasting consequence of the WAC Bennett Dam is methylmercury contamination of fish. In May 2015, Chief Wilson and an elder from West Moberly First Nations lugged coolers of bull trout caught upstream from the WAC Bennett Dam to the BC Legislature lawn. They tested the fish and found that 98% of them exceeded BC health guidelines for methyl mercury. The fish were so contaminated that they had to get a hazardous waste permit to dispose of them at the local landfill. Bull trout, which will also be contaminated by methyl mercury for Sightsee, and according to BC Hydro, they and other fish, such as Arctic grayling and other fish of cultural importance to First Nations, will not be safe to eat for several generations. Because bull trout are a species that are vulnerable to extinction, BC Hydro is obliged to come up with a mitigation plan for them. And this mitigation plan is outlined in one of the 15,000 pages of reports that BC Hydro submitted to the Joint Review Panel. And it goes something like this. So first of all, these bull trout spawn in the Halfway River, which will be upstream of the Sightsee Dam. And the plan is to spend $127 million in total over the lifespan of the project to basically truck the fish past the Sightsee Dam for the lifespan of the project. The fish are going to be lured to an entranceway at the dam. They'll go up 10 vertical meters to a pool. They'll move along to another pool where they will be anesthetized. Then they will move along in a mechanical lift. Any fish that get there by mistake and need to go back downstream will then be sent back downstream in a pipe. And the fish will then be taken in trucks to waiting watercraft where they will be taken to the river where they spawn, which itself would be flooded by Sightsee. And one of the problems with this plan is that there's no guarantee based on science that it will work, because scientists have discovered that bull trout, unlike salmon and some other fish, don't like to go up ladders. There's only one place in North America where there's such a scheme for bull trout, on the Clark Fork River in Idaho, and scientists there have found that it hasn't worked. They tracked the number of fish that went up the ladder the first year of operation in 2011, and out of 25,000 fish that went up that ladder, only 12 were bull trout. One biologist told me that it's been more effective for them to electrostun the bull trout by hand and carry them past the dam. In the summer of 2015, the Clark government, eager to show job gains in areas outside the populated areas of BC, and quite fixated on the idea of carrying on the Bennett legacy, gave the go-ahead for construction to begin on Sightsee 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. And several months later, she vowed to push the project past the point of no return. And the government did this despite the fact that at the time there were 5 pending court cases against Sightsee, and despite the fact that the question of whether Sightsee violates treaty rights had never been tested in the courts. Several months after preliminary clearing for Sightsee began in the late summer of 2015, logging equipment approached the mouth of the Moberly River and the Peace. Thanks to permits that were given by the Stephen Harper government during an election campaign that the government subsequently lost, and in a departure from convention, BC Hydro was able to finish constructing a temporary bridge across the mouth of the Moberly River during the Christmas holidays in 2015. And they moved logging equipment over. And that was when farmers in the valley and First Nations members decided they had finally had enough. This is an area of deep cultural and spiritual significance for Treaty 8 First Nations, and it also happened to have 4 protective designations. It was a designated critical winter habitat for moose. It was an old growth management area. It was set aside to become part of a protected area to conserve the vanishing Peace Lowlands ecosystem. And it was also a protected heritage and archaeological site. It was the site of the first European fort in mainland BC, the site selected by explorer Alexander Mackenzie, and a place where Europeans and Indigenous peoples first met and traded. And so on New Year's Eve, as Canadians prepared to ring in 2016, the Boons and other farmers and First Nations members set up a winter camp at the fort site. They called themselves the Treaty 8 Stewards of the Land. And they spent 2 months camping here in temperatures as low as minus 24 degrees. It was a very remote location. You had to drive up one side of the Peace River Valley, cross over a bridge near Chatwind, wind along a maze of snowy unmarked resource roads for about another hour and a half, and go in the last 8 kilometers by snowmobile. I spent a few days at the camp, about 3 weeks after it was set up, and I write about life in the camp in the book. And I happened to be there on a day that scientist David Suzuki and Grand Chief Stuart Phillip from the Union of BC Indian Chiefs came to visit by helicopter. One of the Indigenous women at the camp decided that she was going to make a feast, and there with they had a refrigerator because it was cold, but with a one-burner stove in the middle of nowhere, she managed to conjure up a moose meat stew in bannock for 24 people. It was absolutely incredible. One of the people that I met at the camp was Helen Nott, who's from the Prophet River First Nations. And the book follows some of her journey as she fights Sightsee. Helen's great-great-grandfather, Chief Makanacha, was one of the signatories to Treaty 8. And she told me that she didn't think he and the other signatories to the treaty would ever have signed it if they had known that they were basically giving away absolutely everything. And in her words, we're fighting for the right to existence. This is my home. This is where I want to raise my children and my grandchildren. This is where my people are from. What will we have left? That's the part that scares me. The home that I know won't be there anymore. The Treaty 8 stewards of the land asked for 3 things. They wanted the BC UC to review the project. They wanted the federal government to suspend permits until an open and transparent review of the project's impact on treaty rights could take place. And they wanted a halt to logging until the 5 court cases against the dam were resolved. It's stuck again. And the campers at some point in time had fully expected that BC Hydro would go to court to try to get an injunction to move them, because they were literally stopping the clear-cut logging of this area from happening. And BC Hydro's plan was and did become to turn this area into a waste rock dump for Sightsee. And so they were trying to prevent that. They did expect an injunction. But what they didn't expect was that BC Hydro would also file a civil suit against them. And that civil suit was filed the week after the Grand Chief and David Suzuki visited the camp. The 13-page suit accused Ken and Arlene Boone, Helen Nott, and others at the camp of conspiracy, intimidation, trespass, creating a public and private nuisance, and intentionally interfering with economic relations by unlawful means. It also sued them for damages and interest, with BC Hydro claiming that the camp caused them irreparable harm and considerable expense. In court, lawyers suggested that that amount of money could total $420 million. And in an effort to try to understand the implications of this lawsuit, which also named Jane and John Doe, meaning that anybody could be added to it, I spoke with lawyer Chris Tollefson, who's one of Canada's leading experts in strategic lawsuits against public participation, also known as SLAP suits. And Chris Tollefson said he had never heard anywhere in the world of a government suing its own citizens. That lawsuit still stands. It has not been dropped by the NDP government, even though when the campers lost the application for an injunction, they quietly and peacefully packed up the camp and moved out. The NDP, though, did keep its promise to send Sightsee for an expedited review to the BC Utilities Commission. That review, which notably focused only on the economics of the project, revealed that the project was behind schedule, that its final price tag could exceed $12.5 billion, and it also found that BC Hydro's energy forecasts were excessively optimistic, and that for $8.8 billion, clean energy could be produced by other sources. And we have to remember that now that price tag on this project has gone up to $10.7 billion. And so upon reading that review, many people felt that this project would be cancelled. But then came the NDP government's final decision on Sightsee last December 11, when Premier Horgan announced that the NDP had decided to proceed with the project and noted that he was not the first person to disappoint Indigenous peoples. That decision came following intensive lobby efforts by construction trade unions, who were generous donors to the NDP, who organized well-attended press conferences in Victoria and Vancouver that aimed to discredit the independent BCUC report and said, does this sound familiar, that Sightsee was needed to keep the lights on in BC. Independent energy experts were quick to debunk the claim made by the NDP government that it was too expensive to cancel this project and would cost BC ratepayers too much to turn back at that point in time. And back then, Sightsee's sunk costs were $2 billion, but somehow the number $4 billion was widely reported in the media because of a claim by BC Hydro that it would cost $1.8 billion to clean up the site if the project were stopped. And I just want to point out that one reason why this was a political decision and not an economic one, because the government could have chosen to absorb that $2 billion, and they certainly found room in the provincial coffers to let go of about $3.5 billion in revenues by eliminating tolls on Lower Mainland bridges. Instead, the government told British Columbians that if they cancelled Sightsee, it would almost immediately add about 12% to everybody's hydro bill. That was immediately debunked by independent energy experts, and many people in the piece, including the Boons and Chief Wilson, asked the BC government to release the financial calculations that had led to that determination. Responses to Freedom of Information requests later filed revealed that BC Hydro had given the provincial government 12 cancellation scenarios, the impact of cancelling the project on different regions of the province, depending on whether you lived in a house, an apartment building, a condo, etc. And out of the 12 scenarios that the government was given, the only scenario that they chose to highlight was the most expensive one out of the 12. And so right after the decision, West Moberly First Nations and Prophet River First Nation filed civil suits claiming that Sightsee and 2 other dams on the Peace River unjustifiably infringed on their constitutionally protected rights. And West Moberly First Nation also filed an injunction application to halt work on the project until their treaty rights case could be heard. They lost that injunction yesterday. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. So to this day, the question of whether Sightsee violates treaty rights has never been tested in the courts. And while the NDP government on the one hand says that it is committed to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the arguments it used against the First Nations in court during the injunction hearing were such that the Union of BC Indian Chief Executive wrote a letter to the government demanding an apology. They said, and I quote, "There can be no lasting reconciliation while Indigenous peoples' rights are being trampled upon, diminished, and frozen in the past, while the words you say to the public ring false in the courtrooms where Crown Corporation lawyers perpetuate neo-colonization." They received a form letter in response. Instead of reinstating the oversight of the BC Utilities Commission for the Sightsee project, the government set up what it called a Sightsee Project Assurance Board with independent members, and they promised that this board would provide enhanced oversight for the project, which was climbing wildly out of budget and in danger of falling seriously behind schedule. Well, who is on this supposedly independent board? We only know this from documents filed for the First Nations injunction court case. 6 members of this board are BC Hydro board members. And they include the former chief project engineer for Sightsee, and he and another person who work for companies that have large Sightsee contracts. And the findings of this board have been kept secret from the BC public. So what has happened to the checks and balances necessary to keep our democracy healthy? Why is there so much secrecy about this project? Freedom of information requests come back redacted. Ask for the total amount of money that British Columbians have spent on lawyers for the government and BC Hydro to move Sightsee forward, and you get a response back that says the information is subject to attorney-client privilege. Other freedom of requests come back with hundreds of pages of information redacted, 880 completely redacted pages in the case of one freedom of information request that I filed. And when the First Nations filed affidavits to support their injunction application, one of them was filed by a man called Harvey Elwin, who's a civil engineer with 5 decades of experience working on large dam projects around the world, including on China's Three Gorges Dam. And Harvey Elwin testified that in his 5 decades of experience working on large dam projects, including in China, he has never encountered the level of secrecy that he has encountered with Sightsee. It gets stuck again. So where do things stand now in the valley? Right now, 80 to 80% of the valley is still intact. In December 2016, just before Christmas, the BC government expropriated most of Ken and Arlene Boone's farm, along with their home and other properties at Cache Creek. But Ken and Arlene Boone are holding steady. They've raised too much of a ruckus so far for the BC government to forcibly remove them from their home, and they are still in their home. And you can see a picture of them here holding yellow stakes. Those yellow stakes represent center line for the new provincial highway, which they heard a week after the Rocky Mountain Fort Camp was dismantled, would go right through their house. And the Boones are now planting yellow stakes to raise money for the First Nations court cases. Yesterday, when the First Nations lost their application for an injunction to stop work on Sightsee while their treaty rights case could be heard, the judge ordered that a full trial of their treaty rights case be heard before the reservoir is flooded in 2023 or 2024. And the court agreed that there is a serious issue to be tried and a risk of irreparable harm to the First Nations in the meantime. The nations have declared that they have every intention of going to full trial, and they say that the ruling doesn't mean the project will ever be completed. So this story continues, and I'm happy to answer questions now. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, for that informative talk. Yes, we will take questions now, so please keep the questions very succinct because we don't have that much time left. You can just stand up there, or you're more than welcome to come to the mic too.
The question is, can I speculate the reasons why the government is being so secretive about this? I can speculate. I think that they don't want information to be out there about updated problems with Sightsee. I think that if the majority of British Columbians knew the details about this project, that they would not be supporting it. And I think it is in the government's interest to have as little information out there as possible about this project.
What exactly are the political gains for the government? That wasn't totally clear if it's not a clear economic or anything.
The question is, what are the political gains for the government? For the former Liberal government, I think that there are 2 political gains. One of them was the question of jobs, because they campaigned on a jobs platform. And at the point in time at which they commenced construction of Sightsee at the actual dam site, the only job gains in the province had been in the Lower Mainland and the Capital Regional District, and they were eager to show job gains out in other areas of the province with the provincial election in the offing. And I think also there's this kind of glitzy, shiny allure of a legacy project, of a large project, of a mega project. And that in and of itself, to say we built this, is also a political gain of sorts. And I think for the NDP government, the biggest political gain perhaps is that they are not going to have to necessarily wear the imposing an incredible cost of this project, because we don't actually have to start paying for it until the power comes online in about 2024. So it will be somebody else's problem at that point in time. And by going ahead with the project, they could just defer that inevitability of it showing up on everybody's hydro bills. And if we want to get an idea of what could happen to hydro bills in this province, we only have to look east. There's 2 other large dams under construction in Canada right now, one in northern Manitoba and one in Labrador. And the Muskrat Falls Dam in Labrador, also hugely over budget, also being built even though the energy is not needed, and the energy is going to be sold at far less than it costs to produce it, is going to add an approximate $1,800 a year onto the hydro bills of every household in Newfoundland and Labrador. And it is now the subject of a $37.5 million inquiry in that province to determine what went wrong and how on earth it could have gone ahead. And in Manitoba, the Kiosk Dam, about 750 miles north of Winnipeg, is also under construction. And that is also turning out to be a huge issue in that province. There have been hydro rate increases of, I think, about 7.5% compounding over a number of years that have been asked for. They were denied, but the day of reckoning is going to come there as well, when the cost of that also hugely over budget project will have to be borne. And the problem with these big dam projects, well, there are numerous problems, but one of the problems is that they take so long to build that right now, the whole energy market has shifted in the last 8 years or so. We're seeing the price of wind and solar come down drastically. We're seeing storage capacity with wind and solar. Alberta just bought new wind power for $37 per megawatt hour. By comparison, the independent energy experts pinpoint Sightsee's cost at about $120 per megawatt hour. And so we have to get out of the mindset that this is the only way to create clean, renewable energy. There's so many alternatives. We also have to remember that 10% of that energy is lost through the transmission long distance and locally over transmission lines. It just doesn't make sense now to build large dam projects. They're hugely destructive. They often occur on prime farmland, or Manitoba, one big issue is that the transmission lines for the project are going through farmland. They frequently occur in fertile valley bottoms, displace indigenous communities, and there's so many more alternatives.
Based on what you've learned about energy management in British Columbia, and based on the lack of dispatchability of wind and solar power versus hydroelectric power, based on the increased growth of demand for power based on the interest in electric vehicles moving forward, how do you see the most effective solution? What do you think the most effective solution will be in terms of managing our energy in British Columbia moving forward?
Did everybody hear that? So the question is, what would be the most effective solution in terms of managing our energy in British Columbia moving forward? There's a lot of talk these days about the electrification of the province, and certainly that is very important as we tackle global warming. The BCUC looked at an electrification of the province, putting more electric vehicles on the road. The Joint Review Panel also looked at that in BC Hydro's energy forecasts as well, and they still concluded that we didn't need Sightsee's energy. Dispatchability refers to kind of storage capacity of hydro so that it can be right there when you need it. And that is definitely technologies developing with wind and solar, which are now having storage capacity when they are being developed in places in the United States. And so I think we need to take the lead from communities and First Nations communities in particular here, because what we're hearing loud and clear from First Nations communities is that developing clean energy projects is very important to them. There are so many communities around the province that want to get involved in solar and wind, and it has so many spin-off benefits in terms of job creation and training. And other jurisdictions in the world are diversifying, and yet we, in this age of new technology, are putting all of our eggs in the same basket, so to speak, especially with climate change affecting rivers and affecting dams. And so I think I see the future in diversity. I see it in a smorgasbord of energy options, in geothermal and in solar and in wind, not in just a hydro project that is incredibly destructive, that violates human rights, that violates international standards, and that quite likely infringes on treaty rights.
Hi. At this point, what do you think it would take to actually stop the project going forward?
I know a lot of people were hoping that an injunction would be issued. That was always a long shot, according to legal scholars. I know I haven't spoken to anybody since the injunction decision was issued, but I know that there are going to be a lot of disappointed people in the valley today. When you go up there and you talk to people, you hear over and over again that the valley itself is going to do something to stop the project. And I don't know if people heard about a landslide. I'm just conveying what people up north are saying right now about a huge landslide right next to the Sightsee work site that has resulted in the evacuation of a little community called Old Fort. More than 50 residences, about 200 people have been evacuated from their homes, possibly for as long as 6 to 8 months. The slopes of the Peace River Valley are incredibly unstable. There's no solid bedrock at the dam site. And I know this sounds a little far-fetched, but people in the valley are genuinely hoping that with all the disruption of the soils, that something geotechnical will occur to stop the project. That is a long shot hope. Other things that could stop the project would be a determination that the amount of money that would have to be paid First Nations for a ruling that the dam violates their treaty rights after the valley has been clear-cut would then make the project uneconomical. Other things that could stop it would be just if people say, no, that's enough, we don't support this, the project should be stopped. I think at this point in time, it's possible that the project will be stopped, but not probable.
I was wondering how you got those environmental impact assessments. Because I've lived in Hudson for so long, I can research that, and there's not a consistent understanding of what the impacts are, and I think it's because there's not a lot of documentation of people in Hudson for so long, in terms of since December of last year, what would happen. And I know you can see a ton of smoke spillage analysis December to me. I was wondering how you were able to get that, the impact, environmental impact.
So most of my information about the impacts came from the 15,000 pages of reports, including technical reports that BC Hydro filed as part of the Joint Review Panel assessment. There's a lot of very detailed information about the impacts in that. It's not all in one place. For example, to get the information about the number of endangered species affected, you have to go through each report on each different type of species and add it all up. So a lot of the information is from that. If you want a synopsis of the environmental impacts, the Joint Review Panel's final report has a lot of information in there.
Yes. When I talked to engineers from BC Hydro, about it in terms of the value, the magnitude, the kind of already in the amount of money that's already been invested, the amount of money it costs to stop. And so when I'm listening to your description, I hear a lot of values being placed on the biodiversity and on the indigenous rights. Is it because those things aren't monetized that they're not included in the end cost?
Yeah, it's very interesting. So we're only looking at the economic cost here, and human rights appear to. I mean, there shouldn't be a price tag associated with human rights. Definitely, we're only looking at the economic part of this, and definitely, when the final decision was made, it only considered the economic cost. And I think, I mean, you can. Just from the little bit that I've shared with you today, the impact is absolutely enormous on both Indigenous peoples and on the environment, and it's time that we did start ascribing some value to those costs other than monetary.
So I guess my follow-up question is, are there people who are finding a way to do that? So when you talk to Suzuki, was he like suggesting that that's a path forward for the long term?
For the long term, in terms of this particular project? Well, I think the thing is there are many people. I mean, Amnesty, you can go on Amnesty International's website and look at what they've said about this project. You can go on the United Nations Committee for the Elimination of Racial Discriminations reports and look at what they've said about this project. You can look at what scholars are saying about the project and about what independent energy experts are saying, but none of that is getting out there, and I think that is the biggest challenge, is that the information is just not getting out there. The information exists, it's not filtering out to the BC public.
Yes, I'm totally in support of what you said about the importance of the non-monetary aspects of all this. But just going back to the monetary one, which keeps escalating. My understanding, and I would really like to know from you if this is the correct understanding or the wrong understanding, is that the figures that we have that keep escalating are, we could say, the figures. But this money will have to be borrowed. And so on top of these figures, there will be expenses of borrowing money, so that the actual figures would be 2 or 3 or 4 times whatever the final figure will be.
Yeah, I believe that the cost of borrowing money has been factored into the $10.7 billion price tag. But what we don't know is if that price tag has climbed in the past year. That information is not out there. I know that there was another $350 million that was added. We don't know if that's added to the price tag at all. And so again, I can just go with what the independent report said, which was that the price tag could exceed $12.5 billion. They looked at all of those things, including the cost of borrowing the money. And my understanding is that a lot of those loans are locked in, so the recent increase in interest rates would not affect them.
You mentioned that information about the, from different intergovernmental reports and isn't filtering out to the public. So I'm just wondering, why do you think that it's not filtering out? I mean, we have like the internet and we have media. Like, what's the bottleneck?
The question is, why isn't this information filtering out, and what the bottleneck is? I think that it goes back to the fact that this is a project way up there. It goes back to the fact that the traditional media, as we know it, has been gutted over the last decade. It goes back to the fact that just on environmental issues, there are very few environmental reporters left standing. And the media is increasingly without resources to send people up to the region, and that people don't care. But I think a huge barrier with this particular project has been that it is a project moved forward by our own Crown Corporation and government, and for different reasons that has made it so much harder to challenge than, say, something like the Kinder Morgan project. So the geographical distance, the fact that people can't quite connect, the fact that there's no impact on people right now because it's not reflected on our hydro bills right now, all of that have contributed to the fact that people don't know about this project. And again, I would just encourage people, it is a project that each and every one of us own, and to ask questions and demand answers. And again, why the secrecy? And I heard that time and time again from people up north, of farmers and renters, who said to me, okay, great, if everything is so above board, why so much secrecy? Why can't we get information?
Has there been any direct action from community members or First Nations?
The question is, has there been any direct action from community members and First Nations? So just after construction started and before the Rocky Mountain Camp was set up, there were road blockades leading to the dam site, and people were arrested. And that all stopped after the civil lawsuit was launched. I think that really made people think twice and three times about getting arrested for this project, because the $420 million penalty was just very difficult for people to think about. I beg your pardon?
C-51, like that? No, after the lawsuit.
Yeah, and there was also a group of people who camped out here in Vancouver, you might remember, on in front of the BC Hydro building, and they were also hit with a civil lawsuit that mentioned hundreds of thousands of dollars in damages, and they packed up their camp after that. And that civil lawsuit included $30,000 for new door handles for the BC Hydro building, because they said they needed door handles that people couldn't chain themselves to. That's all in the court case, the documents that were filed for that court case.
All right. Thank you very much. Sarah is available for next few more minutes, so you're welcome to have if you have a question, come and chat with her or have a book signed.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here.